Yeah, I'll be right there. Oops, sorry. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We'll ask you to please take your seats.
A lot of travel, yeah. I'm sorry? Oh, sorry. Here it is.
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Target, the chair of the Education Committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to introduce our Liberty Series program this evening. The Legacy Foundation, as you know, is the nonprofit charity affiliate of the Union League. We host a variety of programs, including speaker programs, exhibits, tours, scholarships, and civics education. The Legacy Foundation is inspired by the first line of the Union League bylaws: every member shall support the Constitution. Coming up soon on February 12th, at our Lincoln Day celebration, the Legacy Foundation is proud to announce a new initiative, a national civics education initiative. We look forward to sharing this exciting news with you. So a few housekeeping items, and I'll sound like John Miko right now. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones. And towards the end of the program this evening, we're going to have a question and answer session. If you'd like to participate in the Q&A, please write your questions on the note cards on your seat, and those will be collected later in the program. Now, looking forward, our next speaker program is a week from tonight, is a panel discussion next Monday, February 5th, on the Israel-Hamas war. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, our esteemed guest, Michael Gerhardt. Gerhardt is a leading constitutional scholar and American historian. He's written 9 books, including Lincoln's Mentors, The Education of a Leader, and The Law of Presidential Impeachment, a guide for the engaged citizen. He's written more than 100 law review articles and dozens of op-eds in the nation's leading news publications. He teaches constitutional law at the University of North Carolina and University of Pennsylvania Schools of Law, and is a scholar in residence at the National Constitution Center. Professor Gerhardt is not only a scholar and a teacher, he's also a public servant. He's testified more than 20 times before Congress, including as the only joint witness in the Clinton impeachment proceedings, and served as a special counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee for 8 of the 9 sitting Supreme Court justices. Additionally, he's testified at each of the last 3 presidential impeachment trials. And facilitating our discussion this evening is somebody that we all know well, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation, Mr. John Miko. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Gerhardt and John Miko.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Welcome back, Michael.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor and privilege to be back here. I'm happy to be at any place that supports the United States Constitution. So, thank you.
Thank you. And Michael, you've been, by my count, this is your 5th speaking engagement here. A couple books, some constitutional Supreme Court kind of updates, and now this one. Plus, you've been a participant in Good Citizen Day. And you and your wife, Deborah, have been helpful with some of our exhibits as well. So I thank you for all that you do for the Legacy Foundation, and it's great that you're back. So, impeachment. You've written 2 other books on impeachment. Why a 3rd book on impeachment?
So a lot of people think I've written too many books on impeachment. Maybe if I wrote less about it, it would happen less. But something tells me there's not a cause and effect there. I got interested in studying impeachment a long time ago. And that was particularly because I was very interested in the question whether or not the Constitution mattered when the Supreme Court's not around to second guess things. To what extent does the Constitution constrain or matter in Congress? Particularly in a situation like impeachment, when courts are not going to be second guessing the procedures or the outcomes. So that got me interested in looking at the process, and I have written a couple books about that process over the years. That's coincided with opportunities to participate in the process as a special counsel or as a witness. And I thought I was done with impeachment, which, by the way, is a very dangerous conclusion to reach. So every time I'm done, my wife says to me, you know, you're probably not done. And I was in Washington on January 5th of 2021, meeting with some members of Congress about issues that related to the final sort of certification of the 2020 presidential election. And I drove home from Washington, which, by the way, is one of my favorite moments in Washington, which is when I get to see it in my rearview mirror. You know, it's just like the stress just dissipates. And I got home, and then I made the mistake of turning on the television the next day, and I was back in Washington on January 7th. And Senator Leahy had invited me back at that point, so I met him on the Senate floor. And he and several other senators pointed out to me all the damage that had been done in the Senate chamber. And I just remember being rather awestruck, seeing the broken windows, the broken doors, the broken artifacts, the defaced statues and paintings. And at that point, two questions sort of hit me. One was, how did we get here? And the other was, how do we get out of here? I think we got there in part because of a deterioration in American politics, a level of dysfunction in American politics we've rarely seen. But to get out of that situation, I thought, look, a book's not going to do it, but I thought, well, maybe, you know, I've got to go into this one more time to just try and remind everybody what the law of presidential impeachment is. It's not that complicated. People have a lot of incentives to make it complicated and make it confusing, but I thought maybe it would be useful to kind of cut through the BS, so to speak, and get to, okay, what's really the law here? What do we know about this area? What's settled, so to speak, and what can maybe help us in the future if we find ourselves in this kind of predicament again?
So your book is 6 sections in your book, well, plus a preface, which is really part of the first part, I think.
The long introduction.
Right, but those two parts, the other 5 are on the 5 impeachments, right? Johnson, Nixon, close to impeachment, but impeachment process, Clinton, Trump, and Trump.
Right.
But you spend most of that, the biggest chapter is on how
impeachment works.
How impeachment works, which is really a history, I think, more than anything else. So let's start with the history. Where does this impeachment idea start, and what did the founders think about impeachment? What were they saying about impeachment?
Well, one thing that has always struck me, every time I end up back in Washington and I'm testifying in front of the House or working in this process one way or another, is the fact that everybody seems to have to relearn everything. And that, you know, for somebody who teaches law, that's kind of depressing, because we've not been great students of the law here. And so that first long part of the book, How Impeachment Works, is really an attempt to remind everybody, but also just to be able to show, here's what we know about impeachment. And so we don't have to keep relearning it. The House, of course, has the sole power to impeach. The Senate has the sole power to try impeachments. So therefore, impeachments typically begin in the House.
But Michael, go back one step before that. Did the convention in Philadelphia make up this new idea of impeachment?
No. So impeachment goes all the way back to the 1200s. Impeachment, as far as this country is concerned, really starts with the British. And in England, Parliament had the power to impeach. And in England, anyone except for the king was subject to impeachment. And any sanction could be imposed through impeachment, including death. The framers didn't like that. That's one reason why they rebelled against the tyrannical king. And when you read the Declaration of Independence, what you'll discover is it sets forth 27 articles of impeachment against the king. The one figure in all of England who was above the law. So the framers, one of their very first acts of rebellion, were basically stating or declaring, look, we're going to break away from a country in which any leader could be above the law. And instead, when they set out to write the Constitution, they made absolutely certain no one was going to be above the law. So presidents, vice presidents, and other high-ranking officials are subject to impeachment and conviction for treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. That's the Constitution's way of saying no one's going to be above the law, and we're going to hold people accountable, that is to say high-ranking officials, not private citizens, but high-ranking officials for their misconduct.
And we're going to talk mostly about presidential impeachments, but it does cover other officials, as we've seen recently in the news.
Right.
But let's talk about the initial impeachment discussions that are had in the early part of the 19th century. And you have two in particular, Tyler and Jackson.
Right.
Jackson and Tyler in order. Not surprisingly in Jackson's case that people would be Congress would be unhappy with Jackson.
Well, Jackson was a belligerent guy. Now he would have been really proud of that, because he thought he was a belligerent guy. But he also cast himself as the first populist president. He came into office, in his view, representing all Americans. He was the only official elected nationally by all Americans. And so therefore he thought he had a responsibility to represent everyone, every person. And he was particularly concerned with the, quote, common man, unquote. Unfortunately then, men thought only in terms of men. Jackson believed that he was championing the common man. And that meant going after corrupt institutions like the National Bank. And this did not make Jackson popular among people that were either defending the National Bank or defending institutions. He thought institutions were largely elitist and therefore would not be interested in supporting them. And therefore he made a lot of political enemies. And of course, he didn't hesitate to challenge people to duels or call them names if they disagreed with him. And this, of course, provoked even more anger. And eventually, he's got an entire political party the Whigs invented to try and keep Jackson out of power. It doesn't succeed, by the way. But it does mean that there are Whig leaders like Henry Clay who are looking to tag Jackson if they can. And so the Whigs actually try and they think about impeachment, but they don't have the votes. So the next best thing is they pass a censure, condemning Jackson for the actions he took to kill the National Bank. Jackson, being the fighter that he was, decides the best thing to do is, okay, I'm going to run for re-election, and I'm going to campaign against all these fellows, and I'm going to win, and I'm also going to campaign against all these Whigs that censured me. And what he was able to do was to put his party back in control of the Senate, which then proceeded to erase the censure. That made Jackson very happy. What made him less happy is he was succeeded by Martin Van Buren, who didn't have quite the same success in office. But Jackson was the model for a lot of subsequent presidents.
So we go to Johnson. So we have
And Tyler, yeah.
well, if Tyler's a lot like Jackson, though, in that
Yeah, he
same
thought of
respect,
himself
right?
as, he tried to model himself on Jackson. The difference was Jackson was popular, Tyler was not. And so there were a lot of attempts, at least 3 attempts to impeach John Tyler. Each vote comes closer, but none of them actually succeed in impeaching Tyler. And what he was being impeached for, or the attempted impeachment for, was exercising presidential powers that we now take for granted. Things like the veto, or things like the president's nominations of certain people to high office. So Tyler defended those prerogatives and almost got impeached for it.
Fast forward to Johnson, who becomes president, of course, when Lincoln is assassinated. And give us a little context for that impeachment?
Well, this is a great place to do it, of course, here at the Union League. Johnson was universally detested. Nobody liked Andrew Johnson. And he reciprocated. So he was, people would criticize him, he'd curse at them. And he was a very difficult guy to get along with. He also drank a lot. And he was drunk on Inauguration Day, at which time Lincoln said to one of the other cabinet officers, "Keep that man away from me." And they never basically...
Last time he saw him.
Yeah, right? Basically the last time he saw him. And then suddenly Andrew Johnson's president, a man really without a political party, because he had been a Democrat, but Democrats had largely sort of left Washington and left Johnson behind. Republicans never thought of him as one of their own, and they were right to think that way. So hugely unpopular. And then Jackson proceeded to try and obstruct and interfere with Reconstruction, and that provoked retaliation, which eventually took the form of impeachment.
So give a little bit, so this had never been done before. So he's impeached.
Right.
It goes to the Senate.
Right. He's overwhelmingly impeached
right.
in the House. Yeah.
And what is he impeached for, specifically? And what are the main parts, and how does that work? Because I found the mechanics of it and the politics, small p almost politics,
Right.
a lot of very interesting. And I think important to know for even today.
Yeah, the impeachment articles against Andrew Johnson are not what we'd call exemplary. They're not great models. They're impeaching him for cursing at Congress, being belligerent, things like that. The most significant article of impeachment against Johnson charges him with violating one of the Reconstruction statutes that got enacted over his veto. And so Johnson basically thought that particular law, called the Tenure in Office Act, was unconstitutional. And he refused to abide by it. And his refusal to abide by it becomes a basis for his impeachment. The Tenure in Office Act required the president to get the permission of the Senate to remove somebody who had been confirmed in the Senate. And Johnson didn't like that, and he didn't abide by that, and didn't follow that. He just fired he suspended his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. And for that act, he's then impeached based in part on his violation of the Tenure in Office Act.
And the presiding officer is?
In the Senate is Butler.
Is Butler.
Yeah,
and,
whom nobody liked either.
Right. And so how
a
does
lot of that going around.
Yeah, it's a very popular, and Johnson was initially a popular guy because people just assumed they would do what Lincoln would have done, or what the radical Republicans
wanted to do. Well, he was tolerated with the expectation or hope that he'd do what Lincoln did, but he had no interest in doing it.
So much so that the League gave him a gold medal. And then almost immediately regretted it. And that is in fact true. As most Republicans almost immediately regretted Johnson.
Yeah,
but what's the takeaway in that whole? So what the vote happens, and give us the.
So one reason I think I spent time on the Johnson impeachment is because, after all, he's the first president impeached. But we can find through his impeachment, and particularly his impeachment trial, a lot of things that will sound familiar. Johnson had terrific lawyers in the Senate. And those lawyers basically anticipated a lot of the arguments you will hear from presidents who face impeachment to this day. For example, the argument that a president could only be impeached for an actual crime, for something for which he could be indicted and go to prison. That doesn't really track how the framers understood the scope of impeachable offenses, but that comes in real handy for presidents because it narrows the field of possible impeachment offenses. His lawyers also argued, actually rather persuasively, and maybe even correctly, that the House of Representatives had misunderstood and misapplied the Tenure in Office Act. Their argument was, look, this act really only constrains a president from firing somebody whom he had nominated and whom the Senate had confirmed. But the thing to understand about Stanton is he had been nominated and appointed by Lincoln, not by Johnson. And so therefore, Johnson's lawyers argued, look, this statute isn't really applicable to Johnson. That was not at all a silly argument. It was a perfectly good one. Eventually, of course, the vote is taken, and he falls one vote short of conviction. And he becomes, after that, a very weak president. He's got 10 months remaining as president, basically doesn't curse at all, just kind of keeps his head down, so to speak. And he is, of course, rotated out of office. But Johnson, I think, becomes a cautionary tale, not necessarily for impeachment, but for the ineffectiveness of impeachment. Because we have an enormously unpopular president who's acquitted. And that's going to come back and haunt us.
So fast forward, way fast forward, right? We're going to go to Nixon, which is very different in many ways. But give us the basic background, the impeachment articles, a little bit of the politics, and then what's the takeaway? Because a lot of the things that we follow with impeachment really comes from the Nixon.
Well, Nixon may be the best example of how the process should work. He also could be the only example of how the process should work. So Nixon, as everyone will recall, wins a huge landslide re-election. At the same time, however, he's being investigated in the House and the Senate, and eventually by a special prosecutor, for his possible involvement with a burglary of the Democratic headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. The problem that Nixon's got is one of the people caught, Gordon Liddy, has the White House phone number on him, which is an odd thing for a burglar to have. This leads two intrepid reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, to follow the money. And eventually, things start becoming problematic for Nixon after one of the people who works in the White House tells the Senate, oh, Nixon had installed a taping machine that would record all conversations in the White House. Now, this is not the most brilliant move for a crook. Nixon, therefore, gets subpoenaed to turn over the tapes of the conversations. Nixon refuses. That dispute goes all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Nixon loses unanimously, and then he has to face a judicial subpoena and the Supreme Court order that he turn over the tapes. He thinks for a moment, well, maybe I shouldn't. And incidentally, that may be a great sign or example of how impeachment works. It works more often, if it does at all, in causing somebody not to do something. So Nixon decides he will comply with the Supreme Court directive. He turns over the tapes. Portions are erased for some magical reason. But the House Judiciary Committee nevertheless proceeds to approve 3 articles of impeachment against Nixon. And then Republican leaders, particularly from the House and the Senate, say to Nixon, look, you're going to lose. You're going to lose the vote in the House, and you're going to lose it in the Senate. And faced with that prospect, Nixon resigns.
So what's the takeaway from the Nixon impeachment process?
Well, there are takeaways, but they may not be lessons that anybody's going to follow afterwards. I mean, the takeaways are this is perhaps how the process should work. Notice how we have 3 different investigations. The American people are relatively patient at the time. We have an investigation by a special prosecutor that takes more than a year. The House takes more than a year. Senate takes more than a year. Now with 24/7 news coverage, it's hard to expect investigations to be done that meticulously or carefully. But that's how it worked with Nixon. And then what also happened is those investigations in the House and Senate were not done not just by Democrats, but by Republicans. Republicans were part of the process. There was a joint staff, for example, on the House that put together the articles of impeachment. So there was a level of respect and cooperation on both sides that we might see erode later. But that kind of cooperation made the investigations more meaningful and ultimately allowed them to be considered legitimate on both sides of the aisle to such an extent, again, that Nixon resigned. So one takeaway is if we get a president who's willing to acknowledge the law matters, that president might resign. But we haven't had presidents since Nixon who are disposed to resign.
So I said to you earlier, right before the program, the first two, Johnson and Nixon, very well could have and would have happened in one case and got darn close to second. The next three are not like that.
Right.
They just, in my opinion, and you push back a little bit on Clinton, but they were never going to be convicted. They were never going to be impeached, and the Senate was never going to get rid of the president in that case, in those three cases. So you were there for all three of those in a variety of capacities.
Now, I'm not responsible for them, but yes, I was there. Right, yeah.
The Clinton one, it had been a long time since this had happened. Give us the background, what happened, and why was that, what was the good, the bad, the ugly of that? Because you told me some good stuff about what had happened through that process, as well as the bad.
Well, I think with 2020 hindsight, we can look back and think, okay, there was never a chance that Bill Clinton or Donald Trump would ever get removed from office. But that's 2020 hindsight. If we actually go back to the time period when Clinton first faced the allegations and charges in the Starr referral, the referral from Ken Starr's office, hundreds of pages of salacious detail about Clinton's misconduct. There was an uproar against Clinton. More than 128 newspapers called for his resignation. Senate Democrats, members, House Democrats, called for his resignation. And Bill Clinton, true to his character, does not resign. He's going to stick it out. This forces House Democrats, and particularly Senate Democrats, to come to terms with whether or not they're going to be willing to convict and remove a president from their own party. And they conclude they're not. So they hold together, particularly in the Senate, and this is an important realization as well, because we have to remember that the Constitution requires at least 2/3 of the Senate to agree to convict and remove. That's a really high threshold. You're lucky if you can get 2/3 of the Senate to agree on anything, including whether it's Tuesday or Wednesday, much less on removing the President of the United States. So all 45 Democrats hang together in opposition to conviction, which means what? I'm not good at math, but it basically means you haven't reached the 2/3 threshold. So Clinton's acquitted. And nevertheless, I would emphasize that even though Clinton is acquitted, he doesn't get off necessarily scot-free. A couple of things are happening even in the aftermath of his acquittal. One is more than 2/3 of the senators, that means a lot of Democrats, go public and condemn him in the harshest terms possible. Now, if you're president of the United States, that's not a lot of fun. That irks you. That's a stain on your legacy. And that's something to remember. At the same time...
Hillary wasn't very happy either.
No, Hillary, well, then of course we know that what happens there as well, because Hillary will of course build her own political career or extend it further to become, among other things, a New York senator. But the other thing with Clinton is, besides the fact that most senators, and I mean overwhelmingly the senators, condemn Clinton, Clinton's also found guilty by the trial judge who had overseen the deposition in which Clinton had lied and perjured himself. And she found him liable for perjury. And he lost his law license, and he still doesn't have it to this day. So, now we may think that's not a big deal, but I think when you operate in the rarefied atmosphere of being president, that turns out to be a rather big deal, because it really writes the first paragraph of your obituary. Bill Clinton, the second president of the United States to be impeached. Not necessarily a great thing to be remembered for. So Clinton had better hope. He did other things to kind of counterbalance that. But he goes down in history not necessarily in the way he wanted.
Did the Republicans pay a price for this impeachment too, though?
Maybe. It's not entirely clear that they paid much of an electoral price. Yes, the next election was really, really close, arguably the closest election we ever had. But George W. Bush comes out on top, and he's president of the United States. I think in some ways Al Gore really gets hurt by his association with Clinton, more of the fallout really from the Clinton episode. So if we look at the bigger picture of things, Clinton's not necessarily, and the Democrats are not necessarily just getting away with stuff. They're paying prices for it. And that's critical, and people pick up on that.
So the first Trump impeachment, you again are part of that story. You testify. Remind everyone, this isn't that long ago, right? We all remember it, but remind everyone the basic outline of that impeachment. And what's different between that one and the Clinton one, since you were there?
Well, of course, the year is 2019, and it's more than 20 years after Bill Clinton's impeachment. But in 2019, there are revelations made, and this is done through the House Intelligence Committee, that Donald Trump has done something problematic. There's good evidence to show he didn't have a perfect phone call with the president of Ukraine. And that's not my judgment necessarily. It's a judgment of a lot of people listening to the phone call, who know a lot more than I do about the relationship between this country and Ukraine. In that phone call, Donald Trump asked for a favor. The favor he requests is that the president of Ukraine just make an announcement. He doesn't have to follow up on it, but just make an announcement. He's opening a criminal inquiry into Joe Biden. Now, there's no evidence for this, but that's what President Trump has requested. The president of Ukraine, who's new, by the way, just off a TV show, he doesn't really sort of do that. He hesitates. He thinks about it, but doesn't really do that. This becomes a problem ultimately for President Trump because, among other things, he's delayed giving appropriations to Ukraine. Why the delay? Well, perhaps he's waiting for that announcement. This is a bit of a problem because Congress passed a law. It's called an appropriations law. And that appropriations law said, here's money to Ukraine. By the way, they need it. They're likely to be invaded by Russia. That, of course, comes about. And Ukraine's not a wealthy country, so they need some money to help them protect themselves and their security against the Russian invasion. So Ukraine's put in an awkward position in all this situation. This gives rise to, ultimately, a series of hearings in the House Intelligence Committee. Eventually it goes to the House Judiciary Committee because there's concern that President Trump has committed impeachable offenses. They call in 4 constitutional scholars. I happen to be one of them. And we testify about what we think are the grounds for the impeachment of Donald Trump.
And how is that testimony and your interaction with different than it was with Clinton?
It was vastly different, and here I'm not talking about the facts. Of course, we're just talking about different contexts and different facts as far as the presidents go. But when I testified in the Clinton hearings way back in 1998, which I guess is now ancient history, I think I got one angry letter. But all the questions that I got, and even the angry letter I got, were all about the substance of the impeachment of Bill Clinton. And the questions I got in the House Judiciary Committee, I think were all fair. They're all substantive questions about the law. Well, I've written about that. I'm testifying about that. That's all in really fair game. You can ask me anything, of course, about what I've written about impeachment and what I'm saying about impeachment in a hearing. That, again, is a very fair game for expert witness. But if we fast forward to Donald Trump's impeachment in 2019, I don't get any substantive questions about the law. I get questions about, well, who did I vote for? I get questions about, well, who did you give money to? Who did your family give money to? Well, we might consider such questions to be rather inappropriate because in this country, we don't really talk about who you vote for. I mean, you're free to say so, but the way we vote is behind a curtain. And we as citizens of the United States are not expected to be accountable for our votes, as long as they're honestly cast. And there's no question, of course, they were honestly cast. The problem is I got hundreds of death threats as well, including one, which I had described to John, which really scared my wife a great deal. It was a very meticulously assembled card. And if you open the card, you see these photographs of 9 people. They all happen to be Jewish, and I happen to be one of them. And on the left side of the card, it says the Nazis had the right idea. That was not the only card I got like that. Didn't get a card like that with Clinton. Did get a card like that in 2019. And it got to the point where I asked the University of North Carolina if they could help. They said no. So we went to the Chapel Hill police. They very kindly then arranged for a car to kind of watch our house. And it basically did that for a couple months. Because as we all know, what could happen? Luckily, nothing bad happened. But that was a very different atmosphere, let's say, than I had experienced in 1998.
So
it didn't shut me down, by the way, because I think I'm going to speak up as long as I can because that's my job. I have a family that supports me. They don't live with me anymore, but that's okay. No, just kidding. No, we're very happy.
That's why you're spending so much time up here. Yeah.
That's right. Well, my wife loves coming up here, but anyway.
So there's a real difference in the content and what is being discussed.
Right.
Is this true of I mean, was there that kind of discussion on both sides of were there Democrats throwing purely political arguments or those kinds of things into these hearings and the trial itself?
Well, with the Trump impeachment, Democrats were focused on the evidence, which they thought was the proof that President Trump had committed an impeachable offense. Now, there may be arguments to be made about not so much what President Trump did, but how bad was it? That's a fair argument to have, because impeachment is supposed to be about serious misconduct, not just any misconduct. If impeachment were about just any misconduct, we'd be seeing them all the time, and we'd be living in England, because in a parliamentary system, it's okay to take a vote in Parliament on how popular this person is, or how bad a job you think they're doing. But in this country, that's not what impeachment is supposed to be for. Again, we didn't rebel against England because we wanted their system. We rebelled because we didn't want their system anymore. We wanted a different system. And the system we have is the one, of course, we just expressed support for at the beginning of this program. It's set forth in the Constitution. And that makes impeachment possible. But impeachment depends on evidence, and it depends on the vote in the House and whether or not 2/3 of the Senate are willing to go along.
So just like in the Clinton impeachment, though, the president's party hangs with him. They support him.
Right.
And he is, in fact, not convicted.
That's correct.
So from a political standpoint, it's the same kind of equation.
That's right.
And then we have another Trump impeachment.
That's right.
And the circumstances are quite dramatic and different in that, well, there's a lot of differences. One is he's not president anymore by the time we get there. But talk about the history being made there, not just in terms of what happened in the Capitol building, but the way that impeachment happened. Because there are a lot of things that happened that were different.
Yes, well, and one thing, of course, that's always important to remember is context matters. Context really allows us to figure out how serious the situation may be. For me anyway, and I do talk about this in the book, I think the two things that matter with impeachment are context, what were the circumstances under which it happened, and the gravity of the offense. I mean, how serious, how bad is it? I think both those things matter if we're trying to assess, is this an appropriate case for impeachment? But with the second situation, it was very chaotic because of what happened in Congress, because of the violence and the death threats that were made. So when I showed up on January 7th, and then later showed up again as special counsel to Senator Leahy in the second trial, the public were not allowed at all any entry into the Capitol. The only people there were the senators, their staffs, and the police, and the National Guard. And there was a gigantic fence put up around the Senate. And so every day when I'd go in, I'd show my ID, and the soldiers would all salute and say hello, and I'd walk past them into the Capitol. When I stood in line for lunch, I would be standing behind people with machine guns and weapons. I felt okay with that. I felt I was protected. The very people who were outside our door protecting us during the trial were the people who actually protected the senators when they were being chased. Senator Leahy pointed out to me that one of the broken windows that people gained entry through was 10 feet from his office. His door was closed. He was in there alone with his secretary. Now, we're talking about a guy who might have once been robust and athletic, but Senator Leahy at that point was in his 80s and had pretty much announced he was not going to run for re-election. So he wouldn't have been able to put up much of a fight had anyone known who was in that office. And there's videotape, we don't think it's doctored, there's videotape that suggests that people were looking to kill people. They weren't running around, after all, with a noose, and some had weapons. And that's why the Capitol became closed off, and that's why we were it was a very eerie feeling to be walking around halls and hear just myself, hear just my footsteps. The place felt deserted, which is really unusual.
But things were moving much faster than in any other
they had to move
process,
fast. Yes,
right?
that's
I mean,
right.
the articles came out how
right.
quickly?
Well, the articles came out within days. And I think this is because everybody in the House was there when it happened. You didn't need a lot of fact-finding because they were literally there. They were the ones who were, in a sense, under threat. So Jamie Raskin, a former constitutional law professor, member of the House, helped draft the one impeachment article against President Trump. And then it was quickly approved in the House. 10 Republicans, by the way, 10 House Republicans voted in favor of that impeachment article. It then went to the Senate. President Trump was still in office at that time. Senator McConnell, being the great political gamesman he is, decided not to call the Senate back into session. And so for 2 weeks, the articles just kind of were there, waiting to be delivered. And the Senate didn't reconvene until the day of Joe Biden's inauguration. And then at that point, of course, Joe Biden became president at noon, and the articles got delivered to then Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and he began a trial. And one of the first questions was, can we have a trial for somebody who's no longer president?
And the answer to that was yes.
The answer to that is yes. I think that there are a lot of reasons why I think the Senate voted, and it wasn't just Democrats, voted to extend jurisdiction over the Trump trial. And that's because if you read the Constitution, there's no time limit on when an impeachment trial may begin. It doesn't say anything about, oh, it's got to happen on this date or that date. That's one thing. Another thing to keep in mind is if you didn't have impeachment trial that may be able to extend beyond a president's term, then a president would have complete freedom to do the worst kinds of things in his last days or months in office. And one thing we think about in constitutional law is not interpreting the document to be absurd. We think the document needs to be coherent and workable. But if that's the case, then it might be permissible to have a hearing and a trial after somebody leaves office. And in fact, it's happened several times before Trump was ever president. So there was historical precedent. In fact, the very first impeachment happened against an official who was no longer in office. The Senate took a vote then to carry on with the trial. When William Belknap was Secretary of War, he resigned after being impeached, thinking that was going to stop the impeachment trial. The Senate took a vote. They continued with the trial. And that's what happened with President Trump as well. There was a vote, and the vote was not just a party line vote, that the trial will continue. And I think it's largely because there's a view that it would just make no sense structurally that a president could escape impeachment just by resigning right on the cusp of being impeached. That's it. That's all you got to do. It turns out Nixon was really smart. By resigning, he avoided impeachment, if that theory holds. And then Nixon can just run again and again and again. Or for that matter, Jefferson Davis could have run. A lot of different people could have run that would have looked otherwise impossible. And so I don't think the Senate, having just been under attack, was willing to say, we can't reach this misconduct. Something else to think about impeachment, it's not aimed at just everyday wrongdoing. It's aimed at the kinds of wrongs a president can commit, and only a president can commit by virtue of his powers. So, for example, abusing the pardon power, abusing other powers of the presidency. Let's say, using appropriations that you might be authorized to give, but you choose not to give them because you're president of the United States. I can't do that, but the president can do that because he's president. So impeachment is designed to get at misconduct that can't be got at through normal legal process. That's something I think the second trial was all about.
So we have so many great questions. We know how the second trial ended, right? So we won't go too far into that.
President Trump's acquitted.
The president's acquitted. There are votes from senators from the Republican. 7, which is not inconsiderable, but he's acquitted.
That's right.
And I'm gonna get to these questions because these are really good.
That's
okay?
Good. That's good.
So with the little time we have left, and some of them are kind of the stuff that's in the headlines right now, and I'm going to go real quick.
Okay. I'll try and be fast.
Here we go.
It's like lightning round.
Is the President of the United States immune from criminal prosecution?
The answer is absolutely not. In fact, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled in 2020 in a case called Trump versus Vance that a sitting president, at that time it was Donald Trump, may be subject to a criminal investigation by a state. The US Supreme Court held that. Trump's own justices largely voted in favor of that judgment. So that pretty much settles the question. The President of the United States has always been subject to criminal process, and we better hope so. Because in this country, no one's above the law.
Okay, along those same lines, can a president pardon himself?
Well, that's a tougher question. And I think scholars probably largely would say no. Nixon's Justice Department, by the way, said no. The president does not have the power to pardon himself. There are a few scholars that would say, look, there's no limit there. It doesn't say that the president is not allowed to pardon himself. However, the way the Constitution is written is the president is granted this power. And we don't typically use the word grant to refer to something that one can do for themselves. We don't grant ourselves something. So there's a linguistic problem if we were to interpret the clause as allowing the president to pardon himself. For example, let's say the president abuses his power, and then it looks like he's pardoned himself for all the federal crimes, so he can't be put on trial. There's an exception for pardons insofar as impeachment is concerned, which means what? You can impeach a president for pardoning himself. That day may come. Yeah.
That's a vicious circle.
I don't know if I'll be there or not, but that day may come. Yeah.
So here's a question that if Trump wins in 24 and the House is a Democratic House,
Right.
will he be impeached?
I don't know.
This is a theoretical. There's a betting line on this. We want to know your.
Yeah,
your
there's a pool being taken.
Yep.
Yeah. The first thing to understand is there's no double jeopardy against impeachment. And one reason why we know that for sure is because impeachment is not a criminal process. In a criminal process, the punishments are prison or death. With impeachment, the only possible sanctions are removal and disqualification from serving again in government. That's it. So the processes are quite distinct. And therefore, it's theoretically possible for a president to be impeached for the same misconduct again if, for example, we learn something new. That's possible. I don't know that.
But what if we haven't learned anything now?
Then we've got to think about whether the checks on the impeachment power work. One check on the impeachment power is the political accountability of members of the House. Another check is the impeachment power is divided between the House and the Senate, so the Senate can simply do nothing or throw it out. And it requires, again, 2/3 in the Senate. That's another check against the intemperate use of the impeachment power.
So another way to just follow up on that question, has this become such a political, and it's always been political, understanding that, but such a political only issue, it seems, at least when it comes to the vote, that its impeachment's just changed so much that we're going to see this whenever we have a divided House and presidential and executive branch.
Yeah, I think about that question a lot. That's what I think about anyway. Other people have more fun. They think about the Super Bowl and stuff like that. What are the Eagles going to do next year? Hopefully better.
We're not thinking about that right now.
Yeah, I am, because I'm from Alabama. So you know what that means. I think that impeachment has been affected by other changes. So I don't think it's impeachment alone that has been necessarily, let's say, tainted by the rise of political parties. That's been a huge problem the framers didn't really anticipate, and it's been a problem that really has gutted a lot of constitutional mechanisms. The other problem which has arisen is that with impeachment, you still have that 2/3 requirement in the Senate, which as a practical matter pretty much means nobody really is ever likely to be convicted and removed from office. I mean, the worst possible just think of it. Is it possible a political party would turn against their own president? Historically, that just seems unlikely. And so if that's the scenario, it isn't so much impeachment which is the problem and it's been undermined. It's that political parties have just become too powerful. There's a great law review article. Yes, I'm a legal scholar, so I do read articles. And it's called Separation of Parties, Not Powers. And the suggestion in the article, which I think is really powerful, is what matters now is not so much separation of powers, but the fact we have different parties. And the parties control things. So, and I think the other thing that's happened, which changes the whole calculus, is the Senate is not chosen the same way it was in the original Constitution. In the original Constitution, the Senate was chosen by state legislatures. And once the Senate was, through a constitutional amendment, changed its composition because now senators are chosen through elections. And I was sitting over there when Justice Scalia, in his last public appearance, was sitting on this stage. And Justice Scalia said on that occasion, he thinks one of the most dramatic transformations that occurred under the Constitution was the change in how senators are elected. Because once senators are directly elected, they become just like the House, subject to popular pressure. That was not what the framers wanted. But that's a problem which overwhelms not just impeachment, but a lot of other parts of the Constitution.
So let's end with something that you had in your book, and it was kind of your last, it was in the epilogue. Okay. And it wasn't about parties or the Senate or Congress, but it was about the nation and citizenship. And I'll use the word, and I'm not sure you did, but virtue. Talk about that epilogue, because it wasn't political in any way, epilogue.
It wasn't meant to be. I mean, so I appreciate first that you read the book. Thank you.
It's not very long, and you should all read. And it's only $20, and you can get your own signed copy.
He's a part of a special club. There are like 2 people that are in it. Yeah. My wife and John. Yeah. They read the book. Yeah. Oh, and my son Noah. Okay, 3 people are in it. One thing I think we have to come to terms with is that culture matters. And the culture, I think, is what really determines whether we get leaders who are virtuous or not, whether the people who are elected to serve in government are the people of good character or not, and what will people tolerate or not. I think that's all a cultural thing. So whether or not impeachment will ultimately work, I think, depends on education, but also just depends on whether or not the culture will not tolerate certain things. Let's go back to Bill Clinton. One thing about Bill Clinton's situation is, well, the culture turned out to be pretty tolerant of a president who cheated. And once the culture is relatively tolerant of that, it's really hard for Congress to buck that. Now, if we have a culture that is tolerant of a president who, let's say, breaks the law, then we can't expect impeachment necessarily to work very well, because impeachment is a captive of the culture. I think it can only do ultimately what the culture itself has allowed as being possible. And therefore, the fault, as I say near the end of the book, is not in our stars, it's in ourselves. If we don't like the way the system's working, we're the only ones that have the power to change it.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Michael Gerhardt.
Thank you for great questions.
Thank you. Michael, thank you. We hope to see you back.
I'm thrilled to be here.
And please come back this coming Monday for our program on the Hamas-Israel war. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you again. Thank you, Michael.